She said it like it was a toast. Scott is no longer part of this family's legacy. Laughter followed. Actual laughter. As if humiliating me in front of neighbors, friends, and my own mother was entertainment. Then Elise tilted her phone to make sure she caught my reaction. The red recording light blinked like a sniper scope. I stood frozen. Not by the betrayal, but by what came next. My mother looked down at her plate and said nothing. Not one word. That's when I knew. I was outnumbered. But they didn't know the trustee was already in the hallway, and the will he carried? It had only one name. Mine. And it was about to be read aloud, in front of everyone. You think the slap was brutal? Wait until you see what silence does. My name is Scott Maddox, and I'm 45 years old. Every morning, I unlock the neighborhood shop at 6:30, just like my father Harold taught me. His simple creed, a man's word outlives any ledger, shaped everything I am. The steam still curls from my coffee cup next to his old appointment cards I can't bring myself to remove from the calendar. My brother Mark and sister Elise barely visit anymore, except to drop loaded comments about family legacy and fair shares that make my jaw clench. What they don't know is that Dad kept everything. Every receipt, every conversation, every betrayal, documented in leather-bound notebooks locked in his desk drawer. December's chill has settled into the bones of our family home, where the dining table gleams like a judge's bench. My shoulders tighten knowing how quickly love spoils when money enters the conversation. But let me start from the beginning. I pulled up to the house that evening with Dad's favorite pecan pie riding shotgun in his old truck. The recipe card was still creased from decades of Christmas baking, and I'd followed every measurement like gospel. You know how memories stick to certain things? That pie tin had seen 30 holidays, and each dent told a story. The porch lights cast long shadows across the snow as I headed up the steps. Mark opened the door before I could knock, grinning like a salesman working commission. "Little brother," he boomed, but something sharp glinted behind his teeth. Elise drifted over for a hug that barely lasted 2 seconds, the kind you give a stranger at a funeral. The living room was packed tighter than my shop on sale day. Neighbors, cousins, in-laws, all perched on edge like they were waiting for something to happen. Mrs. Patterson from next door gave me a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. The Hendersons from church studied their shoes. Even Uncle Pete, who'd never met a silence he couldn't fill with fishing stories, just nodded and turned away. Have you ever walked into a room and felt the air go thick? That's how it was. The fireplace crackled and popped, but somehow its warmth never made it past the hearth. Silverware clinked against plates like tiny hammers striking anvils. Forced laughs dried up faster than spilled wine. "Shop's doing well," I offered, trying to cut through the tension. "Just landed that contract with, speaking of business," Mark cut in, straightening his tie. "We need to discuss responsibility. Dad's intentions." He emphasized those last words like they were evidence in a trial. I caught Mother's eye across the table, but she looked away so fast you'd think I was Medusa. Her fingers worried at her napkin, folding and refolding it into smaller squares. That same nervous habit I'd watched through every hospital visit with Dad, except now it felt like she was trying to make me disappear too. The turkey sat half-carved, steam still rising, but nobody was eating. Elise had her phone propped against a water glass, angled just so, red recording light blinking. My collar grew tight, and sweat prickled at my hairline. You ever feel like you're the only one who didn't get the script at a play? "Remember when Dad first got sick?" Mark asked the room, but his eyes were fixed on me. Interesting timing, wasn't it, Scott, suddenly becoming so involved? My chair scraped back before I realized I was standing. "Think I should go," I managed, but my voice sounded far away, like it was coming through cotton. Mother's hands twitched toward me, then settled back on her napkin. The gesture hit harder than any slap. 45 years of instinct to comfort her son. Stopped cold. Mark stood too, wine glass in hand. The crystal rang as he tapped it with his fork, calling for attention he already had. The room went cemetery quiet. Even the fire seemed to hold its breath. "Family," he started, wearing the same expression he used for closing deals. "Neighbors, friends. There's something that needs to be said." My legs wouldn't move. Couldn't move. The walls pressed in closer with each word. Scott is no longer part of this family's legacy. The words landed like stones in still water, rippling through the guests. Mrs. Patterson gasped. Uncle Pete suddenly found his wine glass fascinating. The Hendersons exchanged knowing glances that made my stomach turn. Before anyone could react further, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Slow, measured steps, coming closer to the dining room door. Every head turned toward the sound, and I swear you could hear heartbeats in the silence. I turned at the sound of those footsteps, and there stood Mr. Dalton in his charcoal suit, looking every bit the trustee he'd been for 30 years. His wire-rimmed glasses caught the chandelier light as he cleared his throat, a thick envelope clutched in his weathered hands. I recognized Dad's estate file number stamped across the front, those red digits I'd seen on so many hospital forms. "Pardon the interruption," he said, his voice carrying that practiced calm lawyer's perfect over decades. "But I believe this is the appropriate moment. You know that feeling when a room full of people suddenly realizes they're in the wrong play?" The smug satisfaction drained from faces like water down a storm drain. Mark's wineglass lowered an inch, then another. Elise's phone tilted down, though that red recording light kept blinking away. "If I could have everyone's attention," Mr. Dalton continued, adjusting his glasses. "This matter requires absolute clarity." The dinner table had become a courtroom, and even the neighbors who'd been so ready to judge me leaned forward in their seats. Mrs. Patterson's hand fluttered to her throat like she was watching her favorite soap opera. The Hendersons stopped mid-bite, forks hovering between plate and mouth. "This will," Mr. Dalton said, his fingers tracing the envelope's edge, "contains only one beneficiary." The words hit like a stone through stained glass. A fork clattered onto china. "I think it was Uncle Pete's," someone gasped. The candle flames wavered as if caught in a sudden draft. "Not possible," Mark muttered. But his voice had lost its boardroom confidence. "Dad wouldn't. There must be some mistake." I felt something twist in my chest, a mix of anger and shame I couldn't quite sort out. All those accusations they'd just thrown at me about manipulating Dad, about scheming for his estate, and here was Mr. Dalton with an envelope that might prove them right or wrong. The red wax from the taper candle in the centerpiece caught the legal seal, making it look like it was bleeding. Mother's hands shook as she reached for her water glass, missing it twice before getting a grip. I remembered how steady those same hands had been when she'd helped Dad sign hospital paperwork. Now she looked like someone watching their carefully directed play go, completely off script. The chandelier above seemed to focus its light right where I stood, like some cosmic spotlight operator had decided I needed extra illumination. Every crystal pendant threw its own tiny spotlight, and I could feel the weight of all those eyes. Family, neighbors, friends, they'd shifted from jury to audience in the space of a heartbeat, waiting to see what happened next. I reached for the envelope at the same moment Mark did. His fingers were actually trembling. First time I'd seen that since we were kids and he'd broken Dad's vintage radio. "Gentlemen," Mr. Dalton's hand came down between ours, gentle but firm as a church door closing. "If you'll allow me, I'll read it." His voice had that same tone he'd used at Dad's hospital bedside, when he'd explain legal terms to us in simple language. Calm. Measured. Like he was about to tell us a bedtime story instead of whatever bomb that envelope contained. The room held its breath. Even the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to tick more quietly, as if it didn't want to miss what came next. Elise's phone kept recording, its lens reflecting the candlelight like a curious eye. Mr. Dalton broke the seal with practiced care, like he was handling one of Dad's old vinyl records. The paper inside whispered against the envelope. Funny how small sounds can feel so loud when a room's holding its breath. "The last will and testament of Harold James Maddox," he began, and I swear I could hear Dad's voice in those formal words. "Being of sound mind and body." You ever notice how legal language has its own rhythm? Like a church hymn nobody enjoys, but everyone endures. Mr. Dalton read through the preliminary paragraphs in that same measured tone he'd used when explaining Dad's medical directives. Then he reached the meat of it. "I hereby bequeath all my worldly possessions, including but not limited to the family home at 1247 Maple Street, my controlling shares in Maddox Hardware and Supply, and my 1972 Ford pickup truck." He paused, adjusting his glasses. "To my son, Scott Alexander Maddox." The silence that followed felt like the moment before a thunderclap. I could hear the ice shifting in water glasses, the radiator ticking in the corner. "That's all?" Mark's voice cracked like he was 13 again. "There must be more." Mr. Dalton turned the page, the paper crisp and official. "The will continues with standard legal language, but the disposition of assets is complete as stated." "Forgery." Elise whispered it like a curse, her fingers white-knuckled around her phone. "Has to be." "We contest," Mark snapped, lawyer mode fully engaged. "Right here, right now, we contest." I opened my mouth to explain about the weekend visits, the countless pharmacy runs, the nights I'd spent in that uncomfortable hospital chair, while Dad's machines beeped their steady rhythm. But Elise was already talking over me, her voice rising with each word. Undue influence, she said, like she'd been practicing the phrase. He isolated Dad from us, controlled who could visit, when we could call. Mrs. Patterson and her husband exchanged one of those looks that would fuel 6 months of bridge club gossip. The Hendersons suddenly found their plates fascinating. Even Uncle Pete, who'd taught me to fish when I was 10, wouldn't meet my eyes. I could have argued, could have reminded them how Dad had begged them to visit more, how they'd always had important meetings, or the kids' recitals when he needed them. Could have mentioned how Elise hadn't even shown up when he had that bad spell last March, or how Mark's Christmas cards always arrived with investment proposals tucked inside. But you know what? Sometimes silence hits harder than words. Dad taught me that too. So I just stood there, letting their accusations bounce off me like rain off a tin roof. Mr. Dalton closed the folder with a soft snap. Any disputes should be handled through proper legal channels, he said, his tone suggesting he'd seen this movie before and knew all its scenes. My office will be open Monday morning. I didn't wait for more. Grabbed my coat from the hook by the door, the same hook where Dad's old work jacket still hung, and stepped out into December air so cold it burned my lungs. Behind me, voices rose like a storm gaining strength. I heard Mother's distinctive sob, Mark's baritone demanding phone numbers, Elise's rapid-fire legal terms probably Googled during dinner. The front steps were slick, with fresh ice, treacherous in the dark. The security light caught snowflakes falling thick and fast now, like nature was trying to bury this whole evening. My breath clouded in front of me as I reached for the porch railing. "Excuse me," a voice from the shadows nearly made me slip. "Are you Scott Alexander Maddox?" A man I'd never seen before stood at the bottom of the steps, a folded document in his gloved hand. In the weak porch light, his face looked carved from the same ice that coated the railings. The man held out the papers like they were made of glass. "You've been served." 4 words that felt heavier than all of Dad's toolboxes combined. You know those moments when reality splits into before and after? This was one of those. I stood there watching the neighbors' Christmas lights blink red, green, thinking how their cheerful rhythm suddenly seemed more like a warning signal. Back home, my answering machine's red light was pulsing like a wound. I hit play and let the poison flow. "How dare you steal what's rightfully ours? Delete. Dad would be ashamed. Delete. Elder abuse is a serious charge. Delete." My phone buzzed with social media notifications. Elise had been busy. Her post about family betrayal and protecting vulnerable seniors had already collected a dozen sympathetic comments. Mark's wife had shared it, adding her own hints about those who take advantage. I poured 2 fingers of Dad's old bourbon, the one we'd share on inventory nights, and opened my laptop. Big mistake. The local community forum was lighting up like a Christmas tree decorated with speculation. People I'd known since Little League were suddenly legal experts, tossing around terms like undue influence and cognitive decline. The shop's business email dinged. Jim Rollins, whose kitchen cabinets I'd installed last summer, wanted to temporarily pause our bathroom renovation project. Said he needed to reassess the situation. Translation: he'd seen the posts. Remember that old domino chain reaction demonstration from science class? That's what the next few days felt like. Sarah, my Thursday lunch buddy since forever, texted that she was swamped at work. Pete at the lumberyard suddenly couldn't guarantee delivery dates. Even my coffee shop conversations got shorter, quieter, wrapped in careful pauses. I spent nights drafting responses that sounded defensive no matter how I worded them. Dad chose to include only me because, delete. I never asked for delete. The truth is, delete. Everything I wrote felt like shouting into a hurricane. The local forum thread grew like a cancer. My cousin's neighbor said, and I heard from someone who knows, people who'd waved to me at the hardware store were now amateur detectives, piecing together a puzzle that didn't exist. Every morning brought fresh paper cuts, legal notices, preliminary hearing dates, letters from Mark's lawyer. I stacked them next to the unopened Christmas cards, those cheap, cheerful lies about peace and goodwill, and tried to focus on keeping the shop running. You ever notice how silence has different flavors? The shop's familiar hum changed, like an engine running just slightly off rhythm. Longtime customers developed sudden interests in their phones when I approached. Suppliers needed additional documentation for routine orders. The court calendar stretched into spring like a bad joke. Preliminary hearing, discovery period, depositions, legal landmines scattered across months. Each date highlighted in my planner felt like another chance for them to drag Dad's name through the mud. At midnight, I finally silenced my phone, letting the house settle into its creaks and sighs. Dad's old chair sat empty in the corner, still holding the shape of his last conversation. The quiet felt almost holy after days of digital chaos. Then the landline rang, one last shot in the dark. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something made me let it ring to voicemail. The machine clicked, word, and then a voice I hadn't heard in 20 years filled the room. "Scott, it's Frank." Frank Dolan, Dad's old accountant, his voice still that same warm baritone. "Been seeing some concerning things online. Your father, he told me to watch for certain signs. Call me back. There's something you need to know." I couldn't sleep after Frank's message. Spent the night watching shadows crawl across Dad's empty chair while that baritone voice echoed in my head. When the first gray light leaked through the blinds, I hit play again. "Scott, it's Frank. Frank Dolan." Even through the tinny speaker, his voice carried the weight of old ledgers and longer memories. "Been seeing some concerning things online? Your father, he told me to watch for certain signs. Call me back. There's something you need to know." You ever notice how some voices can transport you straight back? Frank's did that. Suddenly I was 10 again, watching him and Dad hunched over receipts at our kitchen table, their coffee going cold while they balanced books late into the night. I called him before my hands could shake sense into waiting. He answered on the first ring. "Meet me at your shop," he said. "Back office, 7 sharp." The January dawn painted everything in watercolor grays as I unlocked the shop's back door. Frank was already there, standing in the parking lot like he'd grown from the concrete. 20 years hadn't changed much. Same wire-rimmed glasses, same careful way of moving, like every step needed accounting for. "You look like him," Frank said, nodding at my work boots. "Harold always said the morning belonged to working men." Inside, dust motes danced above stacked file boxes in the office's fluorescent glare. Frank ran a finger along one cardboard edge, leaving a clean line in the gray. "Your father," he said, settling into my spare chair, "was what we used to call a double-entry man. Not just in bookkeeping. In life." He pulled out a handkerchief, cleaned his glasses, made 2 copies of everything. One for the world to see, one for his conscience to keep. I leaned against my desk, trying to parse his words through the morning fog in my brain. "What are you saying, Frank?" He stood, moved to the storage shelves with the steadiness of someone who knows exactly what they're looking for. Stopped at a section Dad had labeled years ago with masking tape. "Do not touch. Your father called me last spring. Asked me to witness some paperwork." Frank's fingers traced the box edges. "Said if anything happened to him, I should wait until I saw certain signs. Watch how people showed their true colors when money entered the conversation. Ever have one of those moments when the air gets thick with meaning? When you can feel truth gathering like storm clouds? That's how it felt watching Frank pull down that box. Dust rising like old secrets coming up for air. The ledger inside was bound with twine, its cover worn smooth by time and handling. When I cut the string, the pages fell open with a whisper that smelled like Dad's stubbornness. Ink and paper and patience. "Harold liked things orderly," Frank said, running a fingertip down columns of numbers. He hummed softly, the same tune Dad used to whistle while working, and the sound seemed to tighten the room around us. "Watch here. These dates. These withdrawals." I started skeptical. Numbers were just numbers, right? But as Frank connected dots between dates and dollars, something shifted. The columns began telling stories that conversations never had. Small transfers from Dad's accounts that didn't match any bills. Check numbers that danced around gaps in sequence. Dates that lined up too perfectly with Mark's new boat, Elise's kitchen remodel. "Your father," Frank said quietly, "kept proof because truth forgets no one." He knew someday the numbers would need to speak for themselves. When I finally looked at the clock, morning had vanished into a paper trail that couldn't be denied. 3 hours had passed like smoke, leaving behind evidence that would make any jury sit up straight. "There's more," Frank said, pulling another ledger from the box. "Much more. Your father was thorough when it mattered most." I spent the next week living in those ledgers with Frank. Ever try piecing together a story from nothing but numbers? It's like reading a novel written in math. Every column tells a tale, if you know how to listen. "Look here," Frank would say, tapping a figure with his pen. "February 12th. 3,000 from your father's savings." Same day, Mark deposits exactly that amount in his boat loan account. He'd slide his glasses up, squint at another entry. And here, April 3rd, 5,000 vanishes from the checking account. Next morning, Elise's kitchen contractor gets paid the same amount. The pattern kept repeating, clear as daylight once you knew where to look. Dad's accounts leaked money like a sieve, but it wasn't age making him forgetful. It was family making him poorer. Remember those old detective shows where they'd pin photos to a board, connect them with red string? That's what our evidence binder became. Each tab told its own story. Withdrawals, deposits, check images. I labeled everything in Dad's style. Neat block letters, dates underlined twice. The signatures on those checks brought back winter evenings watching him at his desk. The scratch of his pen as steady as his principles. Your father, Frank said one afternoon, holding a bank statement to the light. He knew what they were doing, kept every receipt, every bank notice. But you know what he told me? Frank's voice caught slightly. He said, "Let them show who they are. Truth keeps better than lies." I remember the day we finished assembling the exhibits. The binder sat on my desk like a loaded gun, full of paper bullets that could shatter reputations. Frank helped me draft the motion to file it under seal. Legal speak for judges' eyes only. My lawyer nearly dropped his coffee when he saw what we had. "This," he said, flipping through the tabs, "this changes everything. But timing is crucial. We file too early. They'll scramble to explain it away. Too late. We lose impact." The court's scheduling order had Easter Sunday circled in red. Verdict deadline. January blur into February. Then March starting to thaw. That date began to pulse like a heartbeat. Every morning, I'd walk into the shop, flip the calendar page, and feel time winding tighter. You know that fluorescent buzz every small business has? The one that usually drives you crazy? Started to sound different to me. Became a steady hum of patience, like Dad's voice saying, "Wait for it." When I was young and rushing things, Frank and I worked late most nights, double-checking every number, every date. The evidence had to be airtight. No room for memory lapses or accounting errors. We built our case like Dad built everything. Measure twice, cut once. Authentication is key, my lawyer kept saying. Chain of custody for every document, bank records certified, timeline bulletproof. He laid out our courtroom strategy like a blueprint. Introduce the records methodically, let the math tell the story. Watch arithmetic, do what shouting never could. One night, after Frank headed home, I stood in the empty shop. The silence felt different, not heavy anymore, but humming with potential, like the quiet before a storm breaks, when you know lightning's coming but haven't seen the flash. I pulled out my phone, typed out the final exhibit list to Frank. His reply came quick. Numbers hold. Simple words, but they carried the weight of Dad's ledgers, his belief that truth might bend but never breaks. Before leaving, I walked to the calendar one last time. Easter Sunday stared back at me. 3 circles around it now, each one darker than the last. Set 3 alarms on my phone for that morning. Couldn't risk sleeping through what was coming. Locking up, I caught my reflection in the shop window. Looked tired, sure, but steady. Like Dad's old saying, patience isn't about waiting, it's about how you wait. The evidence was filed. The trap set. All that was left was letting time tick down to Easter, when numbers would finally do their honest work. You ever sat through a deposition? It's like being stuck in an elevator with people who hate you, while someone writes down every breath you take. Mark and Elise took turns playing their parts. Him with his boardroom outrage, her with those practiced little gasps of disbelief. The stenographer's fingers never stopped moving. Tap, 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 recording every "I don't recall" and "that's not possible." I watched their lawyer try to paint me as some kind of puppet master who'd somehow hypnotized Dad into changing his will. Would have been funny if it wasn't so exhausting. "And you expect us to believe," Mark leaned forward, his tie perfectly straight, "that our father just happened to leave everything to you, after all our years of support?" My attorney touched my arm. Our signal to keep it simple. The will speaks for itself. Support, I thought but didn't say. Is that what you call those withdrawals? Between sessions, their social media campaign kept rolling. Mark's wife shared another family-first post with me conspicuously absent from the photos. Elise kept dropping comments about elder abuse awareness, like breadcrumbs leading to my door. But something shifted last week. Mrs. Henderson, you know, the neighbor who'd been spreading rumors faster than her garden gossip, she caught me at the mailbox. Instead of scurrying inside, she asked, "When exactly did you start taking your father to his appointments?" I gave her the dates, watched her nod slowly. Didn't push it, but I noticed she'd stopped sharing Elise's posts. You learn to shrink your world when you're under siege. I stripped my schedule down to bare bones, open shop, Check inventory, close shop, sleep, repeat. Lost the Wilson's hardware account. They'd been customers for 12 years. Peterson's auto supply followed a week later. I logged both losses in the same notebook where Dad used to track his expenses. No point spiraling. You can't control other people's minds. Frank started coming by after hours. We'd spread the evidence binder across my desk, reviewing each tab, until the numbers swam. That's when Dad's handwriting would catch my eye. Those steady columns, each entry precise as a prayer. His pen strokes never wavered, even in those last months. Keep it clean, Frank would remind me as we practiced my testimony. Let the bank records do the heavy lifting. Numbers don't need dramatic pauses. I'd nod, thinking how Dad would approve. He always said emotion clouds books worse than coffee stains. The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday. Verdict scheduled for Easter week. Funny how a court date can turn your calendar into a countdown clock. Each morning felt like ticking another number off a bomb. I started keeping the evidence binder by my front door, packed and ready like luggage for a trip I never wanted to take. Some nights I'd catch myself staring at it, remembering Dad at his desk, that little frown he'd get when numbers didn't add up. Last night, I finally killed the porch light, tired of watching for process servers or whoever else might show up with more papers to add to my collection. The neighborhood forum was still buzzing with theories about what really happened to Dad's estate. I logged out, promised myself I wouldn't check it again until after the verdict. Sitting in the dark, I remembered something Dad told me years ago, back when I was learning bookkeeping. Son, ledgers don't care about feelings. They only know true and false, plus and minus. Everything else is just noise. The deposition transcripts arrived today. 3 thick volumes of questions and answers, all that circus captured in courier font. I stacked them next to the evidence binder, thought about how many trees died just to record this mess. Frank called to confirm our final prep session. "You holding up?" he asked. "Still here," I said, which was true enough. The shop's still open, the lights still work, and Dad's old ledgers still tell their story in black and white. I'd never seen the shop so quiet. No customers browsing the aisles, just fluorescent lights humming above empty spaces where displays used to be. The register tape curled out like some kind of surrender flag, showing numbers that made my stomach sink. You ever notice how an empty parking lot can mock you? Dad's old truck sat out there, looking lost next to the calendar I'd stripped down to court dates and basic deliveries. Even the car show Saturday flyer I usually posted was missing. First time in 15 years, we weren't participating. Frank found me sitting in the back office, staring at nothing particular. He pulled up his usual chair, the one that still creaked exactly like it did when Dad used to balance the books there. "This inheritance," I said, running a hand over my face. "Sometimes I wonder if it's more curse than blessing. Look what it's cost me." My voice caught a bit. "The business is bleeding, Frank. Half the town thinks I'm some kind of con man, and my own mother—" I couldn't finish that thought. The silence stretched between us like taffy, broken only by the tick of Dad's old wall clock. Frank just sat there, patient as always, until I got it all out. Finally, he leaned forward, those weathered accountant's hands clasped in front of him. "Harold trusted you with weight, because you don't drop it." Something in his tone made me stop, made me think about Dad's last few months, how he never complained even when the pain was bad, how he kept insisting I learn every detail of his filing system. I reached for the evidence binder, must have opened it 100 times by now, but this time I found myself stopping at that page I'd been avoiding. There it was. Elise's signature, clear as day, right next to a Tuesday withdrawal that went straight to her personal account. The same week Dad was in the hospital. You know that moment when an engine finally catches after fighting with it all day? That's what happened in my chest. Not anger. I'd had enough of that. This was different. This was certainty. Cold and clean as morning air. I started repacking the exhibits, each document in its proper place, printed fresh indexes on clean paper, making sure every tab lined up perfect. Dad would have appreciated that attention to detail. On a yellow legal pad, I wrote 3 things for court. Might not sound like much, but Dad always said the simple truth doesn't need fancy clothes. Speaking of clothes, I laid out my court suit, the charcoal gray one Dad helped me pick when I first took over the shop. Next to it, I placed his watch box. Inside was the Timex he'd worn every day for 30 years, right up until the end. Not expensive, but it kept perfect time. The house felt different that night. You could hear the clock in the hallway marking time like a heartbeat, counting down to Easter's verdict. I set 3 alarms, though I knew I wouldn't need them. Some nights you just know sleep isn't going to come easy. Lying there in the dark, I remembered how Dad used to say, the truth doesn't need witnesses. It just needs someone steady enough to stand with it. Tomorrow, I'd find out if he was right about that too. In the next room, that old clock kept ticking. Funny how the same sound that used to drive me crazy as a kid now felt like company. Like Dad was still keeping time, making sure I didn't miss my cue. Easter morning dawned crisp and quiet. The kind that makes you think of new beginnings. Though if you've ever walked into a courthouse carrying truth like dynamite, you know some beginnings come with a fuse. I spotted Mark and Elise the moment I pushed through the heavy oak doors. Mark had that familiar smirk plastered on, the same one he'd worn at Christmas dinner. Elise sat perfectly poised, every hair in place, looking like she was posing for a LinkedIn profile photo instead of facing a family reckoning. You know what's funny about courthouse hallways? They have this way of making everything echo, even whispers. I could hear fragments bouncing off the marble. Family dispute. Estate challenge. Should be interesting. A reporter from the Herald was there too, pen hovering over a notepad like a bird of prey. I recognized her from Chamber of Commerce meetings. She had a nose for drama and deadlines. Ready? Frank asked, appearing at my elbow with his usual quiet steadiness. I nodded, gripping the evidence binder. We'd rehearsed this so many times I could probably recite the exhibit numbers in my sleep. Walking into that courtroom felt like crossing some invisible line between before and after. The wood panels reminded me of Dad's shop office, where he'd taught me that numbers tell stories if you listen carefully enough. I placed our binder dead center on the counsel table, like setting a cornerstone or dropping anchor. Its weight felt solid, grounding. When the bailiff called, "All rise," I stood straight, just like Dad taught me. The judge swept in wearing black robes that whispered against the bench. Her eyes were sharp, missing nothing. "Proceed," she said. And suddenly, the room was all mine. I started with the foundation questions, my voice steadier than I'd expected. Basic stuff about Dad's business practices, his filing systems, his attention to detail. Every answer felt like laying another brick of credibility. "Your Honor, I'd like to turn to Exhibit A," I said, and the first page turned with a crisp snap. Have you ever watched someone's confidence crack? It starts small, a twitch, a shift, a sudden interest in straightening already straight papers. I saw it happening across the aisle as photocopied checks appeared on the projection screen. Bank statements marched across the display in neat columns. Transfer records, ATM receipts, each one a piece of arithmetic that added up to something ugly. "If you'll note the signature here," I said, pointing to a particularly damning withdrawal slip, "and compare it to the exemplar from Ms. Maddox's driver's license." The overlay clicked into place like a key turning in a lock. Elise's perfect signature, matched stroke for stroke. In the gallery, someone sucked in a sharp breath. A few heads leaned together, whispering. I kept my pace steady, letting each exhibit land with its own weight. Dad always said rushing ruins good work, and this was the most important job I'd ever do in his name. The morning light slanted through high windows, drawing bright lines across the evidence as I turned page after careful page. Each document told its part of the story. Dates, amounts, account numbers all singing the same tune. When I closed Exhibit 12, I glanced at the clock mounted above the judge's bench. Nearly noon already. Amazing how time flies when you're dismantling deception piece by piece. I straightened my papers, ready to call Frank. His testimony would connect all these dots into a clear picture of systematic betrayal. But before I could open my mouth, gasps rippled through the back row like wind through dry leaves. I turned to look, my hand still resting on the binder that held all our careful work. Something was happening. Something I hadn't planned for. I called Frank to the stand, watching him approach with that steady accountant stride he'd perfected over 40 years of boardroom presentations. He settled into the witness chair like he was about to explain a tax return. Calm, methodical, ready to let numbers do the talking. "Mr. Franklin," I started, using his full name for the record, "could you explain your background with Maddox Hardware's bookkeeping practices?" Frank leaned slightly toward the microphone. "I handled the books from 1982 until my retirement in 2019. Harold Maddox believed in what we called double entry with a witness, meaning every transaction left two trails, not just the usual accounting pairs. You know that moment when expertise fills a room? Frank had it. Every word carried the weight of decades spent tracking other people's money. "Could you walk us through your standard reconciliation process?" I asked. Frank's fingers moved like he was touching an invisible ledger. Each month, we'd match bank statements against our internal records, then cross-reference those against Harold's personal transaction log. He kept what he called a truth book. A separate record of everything that touched company accounts. I glanced at Mark and Elise. Their lawyer was scribbling furiously, probably trying to find holes that weren't there. And these duplicate sets, I continued. What was their purpose? Harold used to say, money's like water. It always shows where it leaks. The second set caught any unusual patterns. I moved to the exhibits, laying out monthly statements like playing cards. Could you explain these highlighted transactions? Frank put on his reading glasses, though I knew he had these numbers memorized. Here's March 15th, $5,000 withdrawal. Cross-reference to Mark Maddox's airline confirmation to Cabo San Lucas. He pointed to the next one. April 3rd, $3,200, matching an invoice from Elise's preferred boutique in Chicago. The judge was following along in her bench copy, her pen making small, precise marks. Your Honor, I said, I'd like to introduce Exhibit M, a sealed memorandum from Harold Maddox dated 3 months before his passing. The judge nodded, examining her copy with particular interest. I saw her eyebrows lift slightly at whatever Dad had written about his suspicions. Now came the moment we'd built toward. I placed a single bank slip under the document camera. The image popped onto screens around the courtroom, a deposit slip with Mark's personal account number clear as day. Mark's face went from confident to cornered in about 2 seconds flat. He grabbed his lawyer's arm, whispering urgently, but it was too late. The numbers were doing exactly what Dad always said they would, telling the truth. Murmurs swept through the gallery. I kept my voice steady, professional. Years of handling difficult customers had taught me that calm carries better than force. Finally, I said, I'd like to introduce these certifications from First National's Records Department, confirming the authenticity of all submitted documents. I handed them to the clerk, along with our chain of custody logs, showing how these records were preserved. The certifications made their way to the judge. Each official seal felt like another nail in a coffin built of paper and ink. I could feel the momentum in the room, like a wave that had been building for months finally reaching shore. Every exhibit, every number, every signature had come together to tell a story that no amount of social media smears could undo. The plaintiff rests, Your Honor, I said, gathering my notes. The judge turned to Mark's table. Counsel, do you wish to present rebuttal evidence? I watched their lawyer lean in close, speaking in urgent whispers. Mark's face had gone from pale to slightly green. Elise stared straight ahead, her perfect posture finally cracking. After what felt like forever but was probably 30 seconds, their lawyer stood. No questions, Your Honor. The judge folded her hands, and I caught that slight forward lean that meant she was ready to speak. The judge's voice carried that special tone courtrooms get when verdicts are about to land, like everyone's holding their breath at once. Having reviewed the evidence presented, she began, adjusting her reading glasses. This court finds no merit in the contestants' claims regarding the validity of Harold Maddox's will or any alleged undue influence. My shoulders, which had been carrying months of tension, started to unknot themselves. You know that feeling when you finally take off a back brace you've worn too long? That's what it felt like, hearing those words. Furthermore, she continued, the accusations against the defendant lack any credible evidentiary support. She paused, letting that sink in. The contestants have failed to meet their burden of proof on all counts. I watched Mark's face. He'd always had this way of looking untouchable, like nothing could ever stick to him. But right then, he was deflating into his chair like somebody had pulled his plug. Next to him, Elise had found something fascinating about the floor tiles. I could almost see her counting the grout lines, anything to avoid looking up. Therefore, the judge said, her tone sharpening, all claims against the will and its sole beneficiary are hereby dismissed with prejudice. With prejudice. 2 little words that packed a whole lot of finality. No do-overs, no second chances. Dad would have appreciated that kind of certainty, but she wasn't done. Additionally, she said, removing her glasses, this court is deeply concerned by the improprieties suggested in the exhibits regarding unauthorized withdrawals and possible misappropriation of funds. The gallery got real quiet. Even the court reporter's fingers seemed to pause. I am referring these records to the appropriate authorities for review. She looked directly at Mark and Elise. They may wish to examine these transactions more closely. Remember how I said Mark looked deflated? Now he looked like he might actually be sick. Elise's knuckles had gone white around her designer purse strap. The judge gavelled us out, and suddenly, everyone was moving. I gathered my files while Frank gave my shoulder a quiet squeeze. He didn't need to say anything. Some victories speak for themselves. The hallway outside was all marble and echoes. I was halfway to the exit when I heard footsteps hurrying up behind me. Mr. Maddox? It was that reporter I'd noticed earlier. Notebook already open. Would you like to respond to the results today? I thought about all the headlines they'd run these past months, all the whispers and sideways looks I'd endured. But you know what? I didn't need the last word anymore. The truth had done all the talking necessary. No comment, I said, and kept walking. The courthouse doors opened onto a spring morning that felt like it had been waiting for me. The air was cool and clean, with that particular softness that comes after winter finally lets go. I stood there for a moment, just breathing it in. My phone buzzed in my pocket. When I glanced at the screen, I could see a news alert already crawling across it. Local business owner vindicated in contentious will dispute. Standing there in the April sunshine, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Pride. Not the loud kind that needs to announce itself, but the quiet sort that comes from knowing you stood your ground and let the truth do its work. Dad would have called it honest satisfaction. The courthouse doors swung shut behind me with a solid thunk, like a period at the end of a very long sentence. After months of defending myself, of watching my reputation take hit after hit, here I was, still standing, name cleared, and Dad's legacy preserved exactly as he'd intended. I felt the weight of his watch on my wrist, its steady tick keeping time with my heartbeat. Some victories don't need fanfare. Sometimes, the simple act of walking away intact is triumph enough. I didn't need to refresh my phone to see the headlines roll in. They found me anyway, each notification bringing another piece of the story the courtroom had started. Ever watch dominoes fall? It was like that, but with reputations instead of little wooden blocks. Siblings accused of draining father's accounts blazed across the local news site. The Business Journal, the same one that used to feature Mark's investment tips, ran with "Court dismisses contest against caregiver's son." But it was the Chronicle's headline that really nailed it. Paper trail tells all. Simple, clean, just like Dad would have wanted it. You ever notice how fast people's tunes can change? The same folks who'd been sharing Mark's posts about my betrayal were now leaving comments like, "Always thought something was off about those two," and "Makes you wonder what else they've been hiding." One by one, I watched their carefully curated social media profiles start to crack. Elise's fashion boutique partners quietly removed her name from their websites. Mark's investment firm put out a carefully worded statement about reviewing associations. Funny thing about truth. It doesn't need your help once it starts moving. It's got its own momentum. I drove back to the shop, taking the long way through neighborhoods where spring was doing its best to wake up the world. Every stoplight gave me another chance to breathe in what after felt like. You spend months living enduring, you almost forget there's another side. The shop key turned in the lock just like it always had. Inside, the machines hummed their steady song, that background noise you stop hearing until you really need it. Today, I needed it. That hum meant normal, meant tomorrow, meant something solid to stand on while everything else settled. I walked to the office, where Dad's old desk still held court in the corner. The bottom drawer had been his favorite spot for keeping important things, and that's where I'd put his watch box after the funeral. Mahogany with brass hinges. Nothing fancy but solid. Like him, the watch inside caught the afternoon light coming through the window. It wasn't some luxury brand that needed to show off. Just a good, reliable timepiece that had kept Dad punctual through 30 years of business deals and family dinners. He'd worn it right up until that last hospital stay, when his wrists got too thin for the band. I lifted it out, feeling its weight. Not just the metal and leather, but everything it stood for. Dad's voice echoed in my head. "A watch doesn't just tell time, son. It reminds you that every minute's a choice about who you're going to be." The band settled around my wrist like it had been waiting there. Through the office window, I could see spring light flooding the parking lot, making everything look fresh and possible. Even that old service hours sign seemed to shine a little brighter. The calendar on my desk still had all those hearing dates marked out in angry red ink. I took my pencil and wrote something new in the empty spaces. Hire, rebuild, breathe. Simple goals for a simpler time ahead. Through the front window, I could see Dad's truck parked where he always left it. That truck had been through everything with him. Supply runs, hospital visits, Sunday drives when he needed to clear his head. Now it sat there. Keys in my pocket, ready for whatever came next. Not an escape route. I was done running. But a way forward. The watch ticked steadily on my wrist. Each sound like a small victory. Dad used to say that time reveals everything eventually. He was right about that. Just like he was right about how betrayal can bury a man. But what he didn't say What I had to learn on my own was that honor digs him out. Every time. I caught the watch's gleam again as I reached for the light switch. It wasn't just a timepiece anymore. It was proof that doing right might take longer, but it always finds its way to the surface.